There is one sentence that can change the way we read the Bible. The Bible was written for us, but it was not first written to us. That does not mean Scripture is not for believers today. It does not mean the Bible is distant from us. It does not mean God cannot speak through Scripture into our lives right now. It means we should slow down before we rush to apply it. Because before Scripture ever reached our world, it was spoken into another world. Real people heard it first. People with their own language, their own customs, their own struggles, their own history, their own questions, their own fears, their own understanding of family, honor, shame, covenant, worship, land, exile, empire, and community. That matters. Because when we forget their world, we usually do not leave the Bible untouched. We replace their world with ours. We read ancient words with modern assumptions and then call it plain reading. But sometimes what feels plain to us was not how the first hearers would have understood it. Most of us were trained to ask one question when reading Scripture. What does this mean to me? That can be a useful question. But it should not be the first question. The first question should be closer to this. What did this mean when it was first heard? Who was speaking? Who was listening? What was happening? What problem was being addressed? What promise was being given? What correction was being made? What would these words have sounded like before they became familiar to us? That one shift can protect us from a lot of shallow reading. Because the Bible is not a pile of inspirational quotes. It is not a modern self-help book. It is not a collection of random spiritual sayings. It is a library of writings rooted in history, covenant, worship, wisdom, warning, mercy, judgment, exile, restoration, and hope. Moses spoke to Israel. The prophets spoke to covenant people dealing with idolatry, injustice, exile, and national crisis. Jesus spoke as a Jewish teacher to first-century Jewish people living under Roman power. Paul wrote letters to real communities dealing with real confusion, conflict, pressure, pride, fear, and disorder. So when we read Scripture, we are stepping into a story that was already moving before we arrived. We are invited into that story. But we are not allowed to rewrite the story around our assumptions. That is where many modern readings become too small. We read the word peace and think it only means feeling calm. But in the Hebrew world, peace was bigger than a quiet mood. Shalom carried the idea of wholeness, order, restoration, well-being, and things being made right. So when Scripture speaks of peace, it is not only talking about feeling relaxed inside. It can point to life being restored under God's order. That is much deeper than simply feeling less stressed. We read the word faith and often think it means believing something in our mind. But in the biblical world, faith carried the weight of trust, loyalty, faithfulness, and allegiance. It was not just agreeing with an idea. It was trusting God enough to walk in His way. That is why James says faith without works is dead. He was not saying we earn God by performance. He was saying real trust shows up in lived faithfulness. We read blessing and may think of comfort, ease, success, money, or things going our way. But blessing in Scripture is often tied to covenant, identity, responsibility, fruitfulness, and alignment with God. A blessed person was not always a comfortable person. A blessed person was someone standing rightly within God's purpose. That changes how we hear Jesus in Matthew 5, when He says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, and blessed are the meek." That does not sound like modern success language. It sounds like kingdom language. Jesus was not handing out shallow encouragement. He was describing the kind of people who are seen by God, even when the world overlooks them. Context brings that weight back. Or think about Jesus saying in Matthew 5, "Turn the other cheek." Many people hear that and think Jesus meant, let people walk over you. Be weak. Never resist anything. Let wrong continue. But Jesus was speaking in a world where public insult, shame, status, and honor mattered deeply. Turning the other cheek was not cowardice. It was controlled strength. It was refusing to become like the person trying to shame you. It exposed the wrong without surrendering dignity. That is not weakness. That is discipline. And that is why context matters. Context does not weaken Scripture. Context sharpens Scripture. It helps us stop flattening deep teachings into slogans. It helps us stop turning Jesus into a motivational speaker. It helps us stop turning Paul into a quote machine. It helps us stop treating the prophets like they were only giving personal encouragement for our modern plans. The Bible does comfort us. But it does more than comfort us. It corrects us. It forms us. It warns us. It exposes us. It teaches us wisdom. It reveals God's character. It calls us into covenant faithfulness. It shows us what allegiance to God looks like in a world full of pressure. But if we only ask what a verse means to us personally, we can accidentally place ourselves at the center of every passage. And the Bible does not begin with us at the center. It begins with God, His creation, His covenant, His people, His justice, His mercy, His Messiah, His kingdom, His restoration. We are not the center of Scripture. We are people being formed by it. That is a hard but necessary correction. Because modern culture trains us to start with ourselves. My purpose. My dream. My breakthrough. My season. My blessing. My meaning. My truth. But Scripture trains us differently. It calls us to listen before we speak. To receive before we apply. To understand before we use. A good example is Jeremiah 29:11. Many people quote it as a personal success promise. For I know the plans I have for you. And that verse is beautiful. But in Jeremiah 29, the people were in exile. They were not being told that everything would become easy tomorrow. They were being told to build houses, plant gardens, seek the peace of the city, and live faithfully in a place they did not want to be. The promise was not quick escape. The promise was that God had not abandoned His covenant purpose, even in a long and painful season. That does not make the verse weaker. It makes it stronger. Because now the hope is not built on instant relief. It is built on God's faithfulness when the waiting is long. That is a stronger word than a quick motivational quote. Another example is Philippians 4, where Paul says he can do all things through Christ who strengthens him. Many people use that verse like it means, I can accomplish any goal I set. I can win. I can achieve. I can succeed. But Paul was talking about contentment. He said he knew how to live with little, and he knew how to live with plenty. He knew how to be brought low, and he knew how to abound. So when Paul said he could do all things through Christ, he was not saying Christ gives him strength to chase every ambition. He was saying Christ gives him strength to remain faithful in every condition. Again, context does not take power away from the verse. It gives the verse its real power. This is the heart of Scripture as first heard. The goal is not to attack anyone. The goal is not to make regular believers feel ignorant. The goal is not to act like only scholars can understand the Bible. The goal is simple. Slow down. Listen better. Ask what the first hearers would have heard. Because the Bible was written for us, but it was not first written to us. That sentence does not push us away from Scripture. It brings us closer to it. It reminds us that God spoke through real history, real language, real people, and real situations. And when we honor that, Scripture becomes clearer. Not colder. Not less personal. Not less powerful. Clearer. Because now we are not just grabbing verses. We are hearing the story. We are noticing the tension. We are seeing the people. We are understanding why Jesus said what he said. Why the prophets warned the way they warned. Why Paul corrected the way he corrected. Why certain words carried more weight than we realized. You do not need to become a scholar to read Scripture faithfully. But you do need humility. You need the humility to admit that modern readers bring modern assumptions. You need the humility to ask better questions. You need the humility to let Scripture correct the way you read, not just the way you live. So before we ask, what does this mean to me? We should ask, what did this mean when it was first heard? Then, once we hear that more clearly, we can apply it more faithfully today. That is the order. First listen. Then understand. Then apply. Because sometimes the Bible does not need to be made more relevant. Sometimes we need to stop making it smaller. The Bible was written for us, but not first to us. And before we rush to apply Scripture, we should first try to hear it as it was heard. Ancient context. Clearer Scripture.